The autumn wind came early to the Nebraska flatlands in the year 1887, pushing gray clouds low over the tall grass and rattling the single window of a small sod house set back from the creek road, like something the prairie had simply forgotten to swallow. The house was not much to look at. One room, a packed earth floor, a cast-iron stove that drew poorly when the wind shifted south, and a roof of cut sod that leaked in two places she had already patched 3 times that season. But it was hers. Every nail, every patched seam, every crooked shelf board, hers. Welcome to Frontier Secrets. I am your narrator, Elias Vance. Here, we unearth the forgotten stories of the American frontier, the quiet women, the stubborn underdogs, the ones who built from nothing and refused to let the laughter of others decide their fate. Tonight, we turn back the clock to a cold October in 1887, to a woman whose name you will not find in any history book, but whose story deserves to be told by firelight. She was 26 years old, lean from hard summers and harder winters, with hands roughened from digging and hauling and mending things that most people would have simply left broken. Her name was Elinor Clay, and she had come out from Missouri 4 years prior with a small inheritance. A land claim she had filed herself at the county office, and the kind of quiet determination that does not announce itself, but simply gets on with the work. She had no husband, no near family, and no livestock left after the previous winter took her 2 milk goats and her old laying hen in a single killing cold snap that the old-timers still talked about with grim reverence. By October of that year, she had put up what vegetables the garden had given her, patched the north wall against the coming cold, and reduced her savings to a matter of coins she kept in a cracked blue teacup on the shelf above the stove. Not enough for a proper laying hen, not enough for much of anything that mattered. It was on a gray Tuesday morning that she walked the 4 miles to Grover's Crossing, the small trading settlement that served the scattered homesteads along Willow Branch Creek. She had a list in her coat pocket and 37 cents to her name. The market was thin that week. A farmer she recognized from the east side of the valley was standing beside a wooden crate near the feed merchant's steps, arguing with anyone who would listen about a batch of eggs he was trying to sell off cheaply before making the long ride home. Several men had already looked and walked away laughing. She heard the word strange before she reached the crate, then useless, then cracked maybe, then too big to be natural. She looked anyway. The eggs sat nested in a scattering of straw inside the crate. 5 of them, each one noticeably larger than any chicken egg she had ever seen, with a faint golden warmth to their shells that caught the weak autumn light in a way that seemed almost deliberate. 2 had small surface cracks near the wide end, the kind that come from rough handling rather than age. The farmer saw her looking and waved his hand dismissively. "Nobody wants those," he said. "Something's wrong with them. Probably won't hatch at all." She looked at the eggs for a long moment. Then she looked at the 37 cents in her palm. She asked him his price. He named a price of 30 cents for all 5. She did not hesitate, though her fingers tightened slightly around the coins before she opened her palm and counted them out. He looked mildly surprised that she had taken them at all. One of the men nearby made a sound somewhere between a chuckle and a cough, and she heard someone say, "She's welcome to the trouble," as she turned away from the crate. She did not look back. If these forgotten stories of the frontier speak to your heart, subscribe to Frontier Secrets and stay by the fire a little longer. Because Elinor Clay had not yet finished surprising anyone. The walk home was nearly 3 miles along a rutted track that climbed gently out of the valley floor and bent westward toward the foothills where her land sat. She had wrapped the eggs carefully inside her empty flour sack, tucking the fabric around each one and holding the bundle against her chest rather than letting it swing at her side. The 2 cracked ones she kept closest to her ribs, steadying them with her forearm over every rough patch of ground. The afternoon light was already going thin and copper-colored by the time she reached her fence line, and the wind had picked up from the northwest, carrying that particular cold edge that late October wore like a warning. Her place was small and plainly built, a single-room plank cabin set back against a low rise of ground that broke the worst of the winter winds, with a root cellar dug into the slope behind it, and a lean-to shed attached to the eastern wall where she kept her 2 remaining hens and a small store of hay. The hens had not laid reliably in weeks. The nights were getting too cold, and the older one had gone stubborn with the season change the way some hens did, as if they were entitled to a rest they had not entirely earned. She set the wrapped eggs on the table inside and lit the lamp. Then she stood over them for a moment, just thinking. She had no broody hen willing to sit. She had a stove that held heat through the night if she kept it fed, and she had a wooden crate of her own, deeper than the farmer's, with a flat board bottom she could line with dry straw and set close enough to the stove side that warmth would hold steady, but not scorch. She had kept seedlings alive that way in early spring, nursing them along the same wall through cold snaps that had killed the neighbors' starts entirely. The principle, she reasoned, was not entirely different. Warmth, patience, steadiness, those she could supply. She moved the crate into position, packed it with a thick layer of dry straw from the lean-to, and nested the 5 eggs into it, with the same care she might have used settling something fragile and valuable, which she had decided they were. The cracked ones she positioned on their sides, crack side up, so gravity would not work against them. Then she added a thin layer of straw over the tops, not too heavy, just enough to hold the warmth close without pressing. She fed the stove a careful measure of wood and checked the distance from the crate to the firebox door. Close enough. Steady enough. She sat down in her chair and listened to the wind start up outside. The wind that night came down off the open plain in long, cold sweeps, rattling the single window in its frame and pushing thin fingers of draft under the door. She wedged a strip of old burlap along the bottom sill and added another small log to the stove, careful not to overfeed it. Too much heat was as dangerous as too little. She had learned that with seedlings, and she suspected it held equally true here. She did not sleep easily. She lay on her cot listening to the fire tick and settle, listening to the wind shift and push, and every hour or so she rose and crossed the floor in her wool socks to check the crate. She held her palm flat above the straw, not touching, just hovering close enough to feel whether warmth still rose from it. It did. Each time it did. She adjusted nothing, only watched, and went back to her cot. By morning, the wind had worn itself out and left a hard, bright stillness behind. She built the fire back up to its proper measure and made herself a small breakfast of cornmeal mush, eating slowly at the table, with her eyes moving to the crate every few minutes, as though it might do something if she looked away too long. Nothing moved inside it. Nothing would for some while yet, she reminded herself. She did not know exactly how many days the eggs had already been sitting before she bought them. And that uncertainty sat in the back of her mind like a stone she could not quite dislodge. She went about her chores as usual. Water from the well, wood stacked nearer to the door so she would not have to go far in the night if the temperature dropped again. She checked her root cellar. The turnips were holding. The dried beans looked sound. She mended a hem that had been unraveling for 2 weeks and had not seemed important enough to address until now. Small tasks, useful tasks, the kind that kept hands busy and let the mind work quietly underneath. What she thought about underneath was what she would do if they did not hatch. It was a practical question, not a despairing one. She had spent her last coins. That was true, and it could not be undone. If the eggs came to nothing, she would have to find another way before full winter set in. She turned the possibilities over without panic, the way she turned stones in a creek to see what lay beneath. She could take in mending from the families closer to town. She had done it before. She could offer her root cellar for storage, trade the space for food. She was not without options. She simply preferred the option sitting in that crate beside her stove. On the second night, the wind stayed quiet. She slept in longer stretches, rising only twice. The warmth above the straw each time was steady and even, the way good things sometimes are when you have set them up carefully and then had the patience to leave them alone. On the third morning, she thought she heard something. She stood very still beside the crate, one hand braced on the edge of the stove, the other pressed flat against her apron. The sound had been so small she could not be certain it had come from outside her own tired imagination. A thin sound, dry and interior, like the tick of a hot coal settling in the firebox. But the fire had not shifted. She waited. There it was again. It was coming from the crate. She lowered herself onto her knees on the plank floor, not caring about the cold seeping through her skirt, and leaned close. The straw was undisturbed across the top, the flour sack still draped along one side where she had tucked it against draft. But beneath the surface of things, something was different. She could feel it before she could name it, the way a room feels changed when someone has moved through it while you slept. She lifted the flour sack gently and pressed 2 fingers into the straw beside the nearest egg. The warmth hit her like something alive. Not the ambient warmth of a well-tended fire bleeding into a wooden crate. This was its own warmth, self-made and concentrated, rising up through the straw as if the eggs themselves had taken over the work. She pulled her fingers back and sat with that a moment, turning it over in her mind. She had kept the stove generous. She had turned the eggs twice each day as the old man had shown her, rolling them a quarter turn, no more. But this heat felt different from what she had put in. It felt like an answer. She checked each egg in sequence, moving from one end of the crate to the other without rushing. The 2 largest ones were the warmest. The 3rd largest had the same quality of heat, though slightly less. The 4th was warm, but less notably so. The 5th, the one that had always felt faintly lighter than the rest, was the one she checked last. When she pressed her palm fully around it, she felt something she had not expected. A faint, rhythmic pressure, not a sound. A movement. Something inside that egg was pushing, regularly, deliberately. The way a heartbeat is deliberate even before a creature knows it has one. She sat back on her heels and let out a breath she had apparently been holding since the previous evening without knowing it. She did not call out because there was no one to call. She did not cry because she was not built that way. What she did was reach over to the wood pile, add 2 careful pieces to the stove, and then pull her low stool close to the crate and sit down on it. She folded her hands in her lap. She was a practical woman who had lived alone long enough to know that the most useful thing you can do at the edge of something important is simply to stay present with it, to not look away, to give the moment your full and quiet attention. Outside, the November sky had gone the color of worn pewter. Inside, the stove ticked warmly and the eggs held their heat. She did not sleep that night, not in any meaningful way. She dozed once against the wall with her shawl pulled up to her chin. And when she opened her eyes again, the fire had burned low, and the room had gone gray with the earliest edge of dawn. She added wood without thinking, her hands finding the stove latch and the split oak by feel, the way a woman's hands learn things her mind never has to bother with. Then she went back to the crate. The largest egg had changed. She could see it even before she touched it. A thin line, pale as chalk, ran along the upper curve of the shell. Not a crack from mishandling, not a break from the cold. It was deliberate. It went in one direction, stopped, started again slightly lower, and traced the slow, patient arc of something working from the inside with intention. She knelt on the bare plank floor and listened. She could hear it now. A dry, faint tapping. The sound was smaller than she expected, like a finger drawn lightly across a clay pot. It came, then stopped, then came again. She pressed her lips together and waited. The second egg had begun its own line by the time the sun finally lifted above the tree line and pushed weak November light through her single east-facing window. And the third egg, she noticed, was rocking, just barely. Just enough to shift the straw around it in a slow circle. It was the kind of movement you might dismiss if you were not the sort of person who paid close attention to small things. She had always been exactly that sort of person. She did not eat breakfast that morning. She filled her tin cup with water from the bucket and stood near the crate and watched. And the hours moved around her the way hours do when something is happening that cannot be hurried and would not benefit from hurrying. By mid-morning, the largest egg had a hole in it, no bigger than a buttonhole, dark inside, and then, for just a moment, startlingly bright. A tiny beak, pale as new corn silk, working at the edge of the opening with a thoroughness that seemed almost businesslike for something that had not yet technically entered the world. She found herself speaking to it then, quietly, without embarrassment, in the way that a practical woman alone on the frontier sometimes speaks to the things she tends. The bread dough, and the seedlings, and the ill animals. Not from foolishness, but from some older instinct that understands that presence and voice are a form of encouragement that requires no translation. She told it the shell would give, She told it the world on this side was cold, but manageable. She told it that she had made a warm place and intended to keep it that way. The beak pushed through a little farther, then a little farther still. Around it, the other eggs were tapping steadily, each one keeping its own rhythm, all of them working toward the same November morning. By noon, the first chick was out. She had expected something ordinary. She had expected the small, wet tangle of feathers that every farm child knew, the trembling and the closing and the slow drying in a nest box, the unremarkable emergence of a bird that looked like every other bird until it grew old enough to prove itself otherwise. She had prepared herself for patience and for waiting and for the long, ordinary work of raising something from helplessness into usefulness. What she had not prepared for was the color. Even wet, even matted flat against its body, the down was gold. Not the pale yellow of common chicks, not the faint cream of a Rhode Island pullet freshly hatched, but a deep, warm, burnished gold. The color of winter sunlight on dry grass. The color of good honey held up to a lamp. It was the size of her fist, which startled her because the largest chick she had ever handled before had fit comfortably in her cupped palm with room left over. This one filled both hands when she lifted it, and it did not tremble. It blinked at her with round, dark eyes that seemed, implausibly, to already carry some settled opinion of the situation. She set it carefully into the straw-filled crate she had prepared beside the stove and turned back to the others. They came steadily through the afternoon. The second was gold as the first. The third had a faint copper streak along each wing, still barely visible in the wet down, but unmistakable once she looked. The fourth was the color of ripe wheat, slightly lighter than its siblings and larger still. She had to recalculate her estimate of what these birds would become when fully grown. By the time the fifth chick worked free of its shell near 4 o'clock, when the light through the window had gone to the low, flat amber of a November afternoon, she had 5 birds in the crate, all alive, all dry, all making small, steady sounds that were not quite peeping and not quite something else, but something between the two, a low musical note that she had never heard from a chicken before and could not have described accurately to anyone who had not been in that room to hear it. She sat on the floor beside the crate with her knees drawn up and her back against the warm iron leg of the stove, and she looked at them for a long time without moving. She thought about the 30 cents. She thought about the way the man at the trading post had laughed and the particular quality of that laughter, the ease of it, the confidence of people who had already decided what was possible and what was not and saw no reason to revisit the question. She thought about how certainty of that kind was sometimes nothing more than the habit of being right before, and the failure to imagine being wrong. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls of the shack. The stove ticked and breathed. The 5 gold chicks huddled together in the straw and slept, and she watched over them as the evening came on, knowing already that her life had turned in a direction she could not yet name, but also knowing, with a quiet certainty that surprised her, that she would follow it wherever it led. By the time the first real snow dusted the prairie in mid-December, the 5 golden chicks had become something Elinor could no longer keep contained in a crate beside the stove. They had outgrown the apple packing box by the end of November, pushed the limits of a larger enclosure she had built from scrap lumber before Thanksgiving, and were now occupying the entire corner of the cabin nearest the south wall, with an authority that seemed to suggest they had always intended to be there. She had taken to leaving the door propped open during the warmer parts of the day, and they had begun venturing out into the yard, not with the hesitant, skittering movements of ordinary young poultry, but with a calm, deliberate gait that made them look like they owned the ground they walked on. The largest one, the first to hatch, would stop at the threshold and turn its head to look back at her, as if making sure she was coming along, before stepping out into the pale winter sunlight. She had taken to calling that one Penny, not because it had a name that meant anything in particular, but because the color of its feathers reminded her of a new copper cent held up to the light, that warm, reddish gold that seemed to glow from somewhere beneath the surface. The others she called by their order, second, third, fourth, and the small one, the last to hatch, which she called Late. Late was noticeably smaller than the others, but made up for it with a fierceness that showed in the way it ate, the way it pushed to the center of the pile at night, and the way it fixed her with a stare that seemed to say it had not asked for permission to be the smallest and did not intend to apologize for it. Word traveled slowly across the spread-out homesteads of Willow Branch Valley, but it did travel, the way news always does in places where there are few enough people that any difference from the ordinary becomes something worth mentioning. A woman came by on her way to town, a farmer's wife from 2 ridges over, and stopped at the fence to watch the birds scratch in the yard. She stood there long enough that Elinor came out to see if something was the matter. The woman, whose name was Mrs. Millie Hargrove, had a round face reddened by the cold, and a way of speaking that came out in short, careful bursts, as if she were testing each word before she let it go. She said she had heard about the birds from the postmaster. She said she had not believed it, but now she was looking at them, and she was not sure what to make of what she saw. She asked if she could buy a pair of eggs to set under her own broody hen. Elinor considered this for a moment. She had 6 eggs now, gathered over the past week, stored carefully in a basket lined with clean straw, and she had been wondering how best to use them. She named a price of 2 bits for a pair, which was more than ordinary eggs but less than she suspected they might actually be worth, and Mrs. Hargrove paid without haggling. She tucked the eggs into the pocket of her wool coat with the same care Elinor had used on the walk home from the market, and she said, as she turned to leave, that there were folks down at Grover's Crossing who were saying Elinor had been sold a bad batch and that the birds would not amount to anything useful. She said it quietly, as if she were passing along information she was not entirely comfortable carrying, and then she was gone down the track with her eggs warm against her ribs. That was the first Elinor heard of what people were saying. It would not be the last. The man who had sold her the eggs, a farmer named Vernon Crouch who lived on the eastern edge of the county near the river bottom, had apparently been telling anyone who would listen that she had taken them off his hands for a joke, that he had nearly thrown them out, and that the whole thing was a kind of amusing foolishness that proved what happened when a woman tried to run a homestead on her own. He did not say this to her face. He said it at the feed merchant's counter, at the post office, at the back of the church on the Sundays he bothered to attend. And each time he told it, the story grew a little. The eggs became a little more questionable, the price a little more ridiculous, until by late December the tale had settled into a familiar shape. The lonely woman on the foothills claim had spent her last coins on a batch of defective eggs from a man who had warned her they were no good, and now she was keeping whatever strange creatures had hatched from them in her cabin, like a fool nursing a foundling calf that would never fatten. Elinor heard most of this from Mrs. Hargrove, who had taken to stopping by every week or so, partly to check on the 2 eggs she had bought, and partly, Elinor suspected, because she was a woman who enjoyed having news to carry, and a willing ear to carry it to. Mrs. Hargrove had a way of reporting the town's gossip without seeming to endorse it, as if she were merely the conduit through which information passed, and she could not be held responsible for what the information said. She reported that Vernon Crouch had been seen at the saloon in Grover's Crossing, telling the whole story over a glass of whiskey, and that several men had laughed hard enough to slap the table. She reported that the banker, Mr. Silas Treadwell, had mentioned Elinor's name in connection with a conversation about women's claims and their tendency to fail, and that he had used the word folly in a way that suggested he considered the matter settled. She reported that a young man named Emmett Dawes, who worked at the livery and considered himself something of a wit, had started calling Elinor's birds the golden geese, and the name had stuck in a way that was not meant as a compliment. Elinor listened to all of this without changing her expression. She thanked Mrs. Hargrove for the news and offered her a cup of tea, which was accepted, and they sat together at the small table while the winter light slanted through the window, and the 5 golden birds moved about in their enclosure in the yard, visible through the glass. Mrs. Hargrove watched them with an expression that mixed curiosity with something else, something Elinor could not quite read. She said, after a long silence, that she had never seen birds quite like them. She said the 2 eggs she had bought were sitting under her best broody hen, a Plymouth Rock with a steady temperament, and that she was holding out hope, but trying not to expect too much. Elinor nodded. She did not tell Mrs. Hargrove that she had already checked the eggs herself, candling them by lamplight on a visit to the Hargrove place 2 days after the sale, and that she had seen the small, dark shapes moving inside each one, the clear signs of life developing exactly as they should. She did not say anything because she had learned that some things are better kept close, and because she understood that hope, when shared too early, could become a thing that others felt entitled to comment on. The cold deepened as January settled over the valley. The creek froze solid, and the ground turned to iron under a layer of frost that did not lift for weeks. Elinor's woodpile shrank faster than she had calculated, and she found herself making 2 trips a day to the timberline instead of 1, dragging back whatever deadfall she could find in the thin hours of daylight. The birds stayed inside during the worst of it, in the enclosure she had built off the lean-to, where the heat from the cabin wall bled through and kept the temperature just above freezing. They did not seem distressed by the confinement. They moved through their space with the same unhurried confidence they had always shown, and they continued to lay eggs at a rate that Elinor found hard to believe. She was collecting 3 or 4 eggs most days, sometimes 5, each one larger and warmer in color than any egg she had ever gathered from an ordinary hen. She kept a careful count in her ledger, and she noted that the birds showed no signs of slowing down, even as the cold pressed against the walls and the daylight shrank to its narrowest point. That was something she had never seen in any chicken she had kept before. Winter was supposed to be a time when laying slowed or stopped entirely, when birds saved their strength for warmth rather than production. These 5 did not seem to have received that instruction. She began to wonder, in the long evenings when the fire burned low and the wind scoured the walls, whether there was more to these birds than just an unusual color and an unusual size. She had no way of knowing. She had no books that mentioned such things, no neighbor who had seen anything like them, no letter from the Territorial Agricultural Office to tell her what she might have stumbled upon. The letter she had been promised had not come. She told herself that was not surprising. Men in offices had other concerns, and a claim filed by a woman living alone in a sod house on the edge of the territory was not likely to be high on anyone's list of priorities. But she had hoped, and the hope had faded into a quiet acceptance that she would have to find her own answers. It was late January when the first serious trouble arrived. A man named Walter Prentice pulled up to her fence line in a buckboard wagon, accompanied by a younger man she did not recognize, and sat looking at her property with the particular expression of someone who had come to render a judgment and was not planning to stay long. Walter Prentice was the largest landowner in the county, with a spread of nearly 1,000 acres to the south and west, and a reputation for getting what he wanted through a combination of money and force of personality that left smaller farmers wary of crossing him. He was not a cruel man, as far as Elinor knew, but he was a man who believed in order and predictability, and he had little patience for things that upset either. He climbed down from the wagon without waiting for an invitation and walked to the enclosure where the birds were scratching in the thin January light. He stood there for a long time without saying anything, his hands in the pockets of his heavy coat, his breath clouding in the cold air. Then he turned to Elinor, who had come out of the cabin and was standing on the step with her arms crossed, and he said, in a voice that carried the weight of a man used to being listened to, "I heard you were keeping something strange out here." Elinor did not answer immediately. She had learned long ago that silence could be a more effective response than words, especially when the person speaking was trying to draw you into an argument on their terms. She waited. Prentice shifted his weight and looked at the birds again. The largest one, Penny, had stopped scratching and was watching him with the same steady, assessing gaze she turned on everything new. Prentice seemed to notice this, and it appeared to make him uncomfortable, though he would never have admitted it. He said, "I've been raising poultry for 20 years. I've seen crosses, I've seen mutations, I've seen every kind of oddity that comes out of a bad hatch. These birds don't look like any of that. They look like they walked out of a different country entirely." He paused, then added, "I'd like to buy them, all 5. Name your price." Elinor looked at him. She felt something tighten in her chest, a protective instinct that surprised her with its strength. She said, "They're not for sale." Prentice frowned. He was not a man who heard that word often, and it showed in the way his jaw shifted and his eyes narrowed. He said, "You don't know what you've got here. These birds could be worth something, something real, to the right people. But you're a woman alone on a claim that's barely producing, and winter isn't finished with this valley yet. I'm offering you a way out of a situation that's going to get harder before it gets easier. You'd be smart to take it." Elinor did not raise her voice. She did not step forward or back. She simply said again, "They're not for sale, Mr. Prentice. Not today, not any day." Prentice held her gaze for a long moment. The younger man in the wagon shifted uncomfortably, looking between them as if he wanted to be somewhere else. Then Prentice laughed, a short, hard sound that had no warmth in it, and said, "You'll change your mind before spring. They always do." He climbed back into the wagon and took the reins. And as he drove away, he called over his shoulder, "When you're ready to talk sense, you know where to find me." Elinor stood on the step until the wagon disappeared over the ridge. Then she went inside, bolted the door behind her, and sat down at the table with her hands flat on the wood, breathing slowly until the shaking in her hands stopped. She had not realized until that moment how much she had come to depend on the birds, not just for the eggs they gave her and the hope they represented, but for something deeper, something she could not put into words. They had come to her from nowhere, from a batch of eggs that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. And they had thrived under her care in a way that felt like an answer to a question she had not known she was asking. They were hers, and she would not let Walter Prentice or anyone else take them from her. That night, after she had fed the birds and banked the fire and checked the latch on the enclosure 3 times, she sat in the dark with her back against the wall and listened to the soft, musical sounds the birds made in their sleep. The sound was low and steady, like a distant creek running over stones, and it filled the small cabin with something that felt almost like company. She had not had company in a long time, not the kind that mattered, and she had not realized until now how much she had missed it. She closed her eyes and let the sounds settle around her, and for a little while the cold and the silence and the weight of Walter Prentice's threat seemed to recede, pushed back by the warmth of 5 golden birds breathing in the dark. The next morning, Mrs. Hargrove arrived before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, her face flushed with cold and excitement. She had news, and she could not wait to deliver it. The 2 eggs she had bought from Elinor had hatched the previous afternoon, producing 2 healthy chicks that looked exactly like the ones Elinor had raised, golden, large, and marked with that faint copper along the wing edges that set them apart from anything else in the valley. Mrs. Hargrove was practically trembling with the wonder of it. She said she had named them already, one Hope and the other Grace, and she said that her husband, who had been skeptical, had stood at the enclosure for nearly an hour just watching them move. She said she had come to ask if Elinor had more eggs for sale, because there were other women in the valley who had heard and who wanted to try their luck. Elinor looked at her for a long moment. Then she went to the basket by the stove, where 7 eggs lay nested in clean straw, smooth and warm and the color of honey in good light. She counted out 3 pairs, wrapped them carefully in a cloth, and handed them to Mrs. Hargrove without naming a price, trusting that the woman would pay what was fair. Mrs. Hargrove took them as if they were made of glass, and she said, before she left, that there were folks in town who were starting to wonder if maybe Elinor had not been as foolish as they thought. She said it quietly, the way she always passed news, but there was something different in her voice this time, a note of respect that had not been there before, as if the hatching of those 2 small chicks had shifted something in the balance of things. Elinor watched her go, and then she went out to the enclosure and stood among her birds while the morning light grew stronger. Penny came over and pressed her warm body against Elinor's ankle, a gesture that seemed accidental, but which Elinor understood was not. She reached down and ran her fingers along the golden feathers, feeling the deep warmth that radiated from the bird's body even in the cold air. She thought about Walter Prentice and his offer, about Vernon Crouch and his laughter, about the men at the trading post who had chuckled when she walked away with her flour sack full of eggs no one wanted. She thought about all of it, and she found that none of it weighed on her the way it had before. The birds were spreading. The eggs were hatching in other hands now, in other corners of the valley, And the thing that had begun as a single absurd decision on a gray Tuesday in October was becoming something larger than she had ever imagined. She did not know where it would lead, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was not finished yet, and neither were they. Spring came late to Willow Branch Valley that year, as if the winter had decided to hold on a little longer out of spite. And when the thaw finally arrived in the second week of March, it came all at once in a rush of meltwater that turned the creek into a brown, churning flood and left the low fields standing in muddy lakes for days. Elinor watched the water rise from her cabin step, measuring the distance between the nearest overflow and her root cellar door, and she calculated that she had perhaps a day before she would need to move her stores to higher ground. The birds, now 12 in number, the original 5 plus 7 chicks, hatched from the eggs she had sold and then bought back as pullets from Mrs. Hargrove, were scratching in the muddy yard without any apparent concern, their golden feathers catching the watery sunlight in a way that made them look almost luminous against the drab landscape. Penny had grown into a bird of remarkable size, standing nearly as high as Elinor's knee, with a comb that had developed a deep crimson color and a tail that swept the ground in a cascade of copper and gold. The others had grown proportionally, though none quite matched Penny's stature, and they moved through the yard with the same unhurried authority that had marked them from the first week of their lives. The letter from the Territorial Agricultural Office arrived on a Thursday, carried by a rider who had been paid extra to deliver it directly rather than leaving it at the post office for general pickup. Elinor recognized the seal on the envelope and opened it with hands that were steadier than she expected. The letter was brief and formal, signed by a deputy director named Jeremiah Stokes, and it informed her that the department had received multiple inquiries regarding the unusual poultry she was known to keep on her claim. It stated that a representative would be dispatched to conduct an inspection and assessment in the coming weeks, and that she was to cooperate fully with any requests made by said representative. The tone was neutral, bureaucratic, neither friendly nor hostile, but there was a phrase near the end that caught her attention and held it. In light of certain concerns raised by prominent members of the community regarding the origin and nature of your stock. She read that sentence 3 times, and each time she felt a cold thread of unease tighten in her chest. Prominent members of the community. She did not have to guess who that meant. She folded the letter and placed it in the wooden box beside her bed, next to the first letter she had received the previous autumn, and she sat down at the table to think. The representative would come. He would look at her birds, ask his questions, write his report. And then the matter would be decided by men who had never set foot on her land, who had never watched the birds hatch from eggs that everyone else had dismissed, who had never sat on the floor beside a crate of straw and felt the warmth of something new pushing its way into the world. She had no influence, no connections, no way to shape what they would decide. The only thing she had was what she had always had, her own steady hands, and the willingness to keep going when keeping going seemed like the hardest thing in the world. She went out to the enclosure and stood among the birds, and they gathered around her legs in a loose circle, making their low, musical sounds. Penny pressed her head against Elinor's palm, a gesture that had become routine between them, and Elinor felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. She did not know what the Territorial Office would decide, but she knew that whatever happened, she would not let them take these birds without a fight. She had spent 30 cents and walked home with a flour sack full of eggs that no one wanted. She had raised them through a winter that had killed other people's livestock. She had watched them grow into something that no one in the valley had ever seen before. And she would not let Walter Prentice or anyone else turn that into a case against her. The news of the impending inspection spread through the valley faster than the meltwater had. Mrs. Hargrove brought the report a day after the letter arrived, her face troubled in a way that Elinor had not seen before. She said that Vernon Crouch had been seen at the feed merchant's counter, telling anyone who would listen that the Territorial Office was finally going to sort out what was really going on out at the Clay claim, and that the whole business would be put to rest once and for all. She said that Walter Prentice had been heard saying that he had written to the Capitol himself, expressing his concerns about the potential risks posed by unregistered stock being raised in close proximity to established farming operations. She said that a group of men had gathered at the livery stable the previous evening, and that Emmett Dawes had made a joke about the golden geese that had gotten more laughter than it deserved. The mood in town, she said, had shifted. The initial curiosity about the birds had given way to something harder, something that mixed suspicion with the comfortable pleasure of watching someone else's reputation come under scrutiny. Elinor listened to all of this without interrupting. She poured Mrs. Hargrove a cup of tea and sat down across from her at the small table. And when Mrs. Hargrove had finished her report, Elinor said quietly, "What do you think will happen?" Mrs. Hargrove looked down at her tea for a long moment. Then she said, "I think there are men in this valley who have decided what they want to believe, and they will not be easily moved by whatever the inspector finds. But I also think that what you have here is real, and that the truth has a way of coming out when it is given enough time and enough people willing to speak it." She looked up and met Elinor's eyes. "There are more of us than you might think. Women who have bought your eggs and watched them hatch. Women who have seen what these birds can do. We will not let them take this from you without a word." It was the longest speech Elinor had ever heard Mrs. Hargrove make, and she felt something shift inside her chest, a warmth that was not entirely comfortable, because it came with the risk of hope, and hope was something she had learned to handle carefully. She thanked Mrs. Hargrove, and when the woman had left, she sat alone in the cabin for a long time, listening to the drip of meltwater from the eaves and the soft sounds of the birds in the yard. She thought about the women Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned, the ones who had bought eggs and watched them hatch. She had not kept track of them all, had not sought them out or asked for their allegiance. But they were there, scattered across the valley, each one holding a piece of the same story. And that meant she was not as alone as Walter Prentice believed. The inspection was scheduled for the first week of April, and the days leading up to it passed in a strange suspension, as if the entire valley was holding its breath. Elinor kept to her routine. She fed the birds, collected the eggs, repaired a section of fence that had been damaged by the flooding. She did not go to town, partly because she did not want to face the looks and the whispers, and partly because she did not want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her unsettled. She spent her evenings by the stove, reading the same passage in her ledger over and over, tracing the lines she had written about each bird's growth and coloring and laying patterns. And she found that the act of recording, of putting the truth down in ink where it could not be argued with, was a comfort she had not known she needed. On the evening before the inspection, a knock came at her door. It was full dark, and the wind had picked up from the north, carrying the smell of rain. Elinor opened the door to find a young man standing on her step, hat in hand, his face half hidden in the shadows. She recognized him after a moment as the younger man who had been in the wagon with Walter Prentice on the day of his visit. He looked nervous, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, and he spoke quickly, as if he were afraid of losing his nerve. He said his name was Thomas Briggs, and he worked for Mr. Prentice, and he had come because he thought she ought to know that Mr. Prentice had sent a second letter to the capital, one that contained specific allegations about the health and origin of her birds. He did not know exactly what was in the letter, but he knew that it was serious, and he knew that the inspector who was coming had been chosen in part because of his connection to Mr. Prentice through a mutual business arrangement. He said all of this in a rush, and then he looked at the ground and said that he was sorry, and that he had not wanted to get involved, but that he had seen her birds once when Mr. Prentice had brought him along, and he had never forgotten them, and he did not think it was right. Elinor stood in the doorway and looked at the young man. She did not know whether to trust him, but she could see the cost of his visit in the way his hands trembled and the way he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. She thanked him, quietly and sincerely, and she watched him disappear into the darkness of the track that led back toward the main road. Then she closed the door and stood with her back against it, her heart beating hard in her chest. The inspector had been chosen in advance. The outcome had been arranged before the man had even set foot on her land. She had known, somewhere deep down, that this was how it would work, that the men with influence and money and connections would move the pieces of the board in ways she could not see, let alone counter. But knowing it and having it confirmed were two different things, and the confirmation landed like a stone in her stomach. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the stove with a blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the birds shift and settle in their enclosure through the crack in the door. And she turned the problem over in her mind the way she had turned the eggs in their crate all those months ago, looking for the right angle, the right approach. She could not match Prentice's influence. She could not match his money. But she had something he did not have, something that could not be bought or arranged or pressured into existence. She had the birds themselves. She had the eggs that were hatching in a dozen homes across the valley. She had the truth of what she had done, and she had the record she had kept in her own hand, and she had the witnesses who had seen the first 5 emerge from their shells in the cold November light. It might not be enough, but it was what she had, and she would use it. The inspector arrived at mid-morning on a Tuesday, driving a buggy that was too clean for the muddy roads, and wearing a suit that looked like it had been pressed that morning. His name was Harold Finchley, and he had the brisk, professional manner of a man who had done this kind of work 100 times and did not expect to be surprised. He introduced himself formally, showed her his credentials, and asked to see the birds. Elinor led him to the enclosure and stood back while he examined them, making notes in a small leather book, asking questions about their diet, their housing, their rate of lay, their origin. She answered each question carefully, offering the same details she had given in her ledger, and she watched his face for any sign of what he was thinking. His expression gave nothing away. He was a man who had learned to keep his judgments to himself, and he was very good at it. When he had finished his inspection, he closed his notebook and looked at her with an expression that might have been curiosity or might have been something else entirely. He said, "These are remarkable birds, Mrs. Clay. I have never seen anything quite like them in my years of service." He paused, and then he added, "I have been asked to pay particular attention to certain concerns regarding the provenance of your stock. I am sure you understand that the department has a responsibility to ensure that all livestock in the territory meets established standards of health and documentation." He said it in a tone that was carefully neutral, but Elinor heard the weight behind the words. She understood what he was not saying. She understood that the concerns he had been asked to pay attention to were the ones Walter Prentice had raised, and that the outcome of his visit might already be written in the margins of his notebook. She looked at him steadily and said, "I bought 5 eggs from a farmer named Vernon Crouch on October 18th of last year. I paid 30 cents for them. I hatched them in a crate beside my stove. I have kept a record of their growth, their feeding, and their egg production since the day they emerged. I have sold eggs to neighbors who have hatched them successfully. Everything I have done is documented, and everything I have done is honest." She paused, and then she added, "If there are questions about the origin of these birds, I would be grateful for the opportunity to answer them directly, rather than having the answers filtered through the concerns of men who have never set foot on this land." Finchley looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I will include your statement in my report, Mrs. Clay. The department will make its determination based on the full record." He put his notebook in his pocket, nodded once, and walked back to his buggy. He did not say goodbye. He did not say what he would recommend. He simply climbed into the buggy, took up the reins, and drove away down the muddy track, leaving Elinor standing alone in the yard with her birds gathered around her feet and the cold spring wind pulling at her shawl. She waited 3 weeks for the department's decision. The days were the longest of her life, longer than the winter nights when the wind had pressed against the walls and the fire had burned low, and she had wondered whether she would make it through to spring. She kept to her routine, feeding the birds, collecting the eggs, repairing the fence, checking the root cellar. But the work felt hollow, as if she were going through the motions while the real action was happening somewhere else, in a room she could not enter, among men who had never seen her birds and would never understand what they meant. Mrs. Hargrove came by twice a week, bringing news from town and trying to keep Elinor's spirits up. She reported that the mood had shifted again, that the laughter had died down and been replaced by a kind of uneasy waiting, as if the whole valley was holding its breath along with her. She reported that Vernon Crouch had stopped telling the story of the eggs, perhaps because it had become less amusing as the birds continued to thrive. She reported that Walter Prentice had been seen in deep conversation with the banker, Silas Treadwell, and that there was talk of calling in certain debts and claims. She did not say what that meant for Elinor, but Elinor understood. The pressure was not going to stop. It was only going to find new avenues to apply itself. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the same rider who had brought the first one, and Elinor opened it with hands that were shaking despite her efforts to steady them. The letter was from Jeremiah Stokes, Deputy Director, and it stated that the department had reviewed the report submitted by Inspector Finchley and had determined that the birds being kept on her claim did not fall under any existing classification for restricted or regulated poultry. It stated that she was free to continue keeping them, to sell eggs and stock, and to operate her homestead without interference from the territorial office. It stated that the department appreciated her cooperation and wished her well in her endeavors. She read the letter 3 times, standing in the yard with the wind blowing her hair across her face and the birds gathered around her feet. Then she sat down on the step, right there in the mud, and she let out a breath that she felt like she had been holding for 3 weeks, or maybe for 6 months, or maybe for the entire 4 years she had been on this land. She did not cry. She was not built that way. But she sat there for a long time, with the letter in her hands and the golden birds pressing close around her, and she felt the weight of everything that had been pressing down on her begin to lift, slowly, like frost giving way to a morning sun. It was not over. Walter Prentice would not stop. The mockery might return. But she had won this round, and that was more than anyone had expected her to win. She folded the letter carefully and put it in the wooden box beside the first one, and she went inside to start the fire, because there was work to do, and the birds were waiting, and the spring had only just begun. The relief of the territorial office's decision lasted exactly 4 days. On the 5th day, a rider came from town with a folded note from Mrs. Hargrove, written in haste on a scrap of brown paper, and the note said that Walter Prentice had been seen at the bank with Silas Treadwell for nearly 2 hours, and that afterward, Treadwell had made a point of mentioning to the postmaster that certain outstanding notes on smaller claims might need to be reviewed sooner than expected. Elinor read the note twice, then folded it and placed it in the wooden box with the other letters. She understood what it meant without having to think about it very long. Prentice had lost the territorial battle, but he had not lost the war, and he was simply shifting his approach to ground where his influence was stronger. Money moved differently than paperwork. Money could make things happen that no inspector's report could prevent. She had a small note of her own at the bank, taken out 2 years earlier to buy seed and fencing wire, and she had been making payments on it faithfully, month by month, even through the winter when every penny had counted. She owed $47 and some change, and she had been on schedule to have it paid off by the end of summer. But schedules could be rearranged by men who wanted them rearranged. She had seen it happen to other homesteaders, seen notes called in early, seen families packed up and moving before the snow flew because the bank had decided that patience was no longer in its interest. She had always believed that if she kept her head down and her payments regular, she would be safe. Now she was not so sure. She went out to the enclosure and stood among the birds, letting their warmth and their low, musical sounds settle around her. The flock had grown again. 2 more chicks had hatched from eggs she had set under a borrowed hen from Mrs. Hargrove, and the total now stood at 14, with another batch of eggs due to hatch in the coming week. The golden feathers caught the April light in a way that seemed almost defiant, as if the birds themselves understood that they were being watched and had decided to be extraordinary anyway. Penny came over and pressed her head against Elinor's palm, a gesture that had become as familiar as breathing, and Elinor felt some of the tightness in her chest ease. Whatever happened with the bank, whatever Walter Prentice had planned, she still had this. She still had the birds, and the birds were still laying, and every egg that hatched was another thread in a web that was spreading across the valley, whether Prentice liked it or not. The first sign of real trouble came not from the bank, but from the land itself. April had been wet, but May turned dry with a suddenness that caught even the oldest farmers off guard. The creek dropped by 6 inches in the first week, and by the middle of the month it was running at barely a trickle. The grass that had greened so promisingly in March began to brown at the tips, and the wind, which had always been a presence in the valley, took on a new quality, hotter, drier, carrying the taste of dust long before the soil had actually begun to lift. Elinor watched the sky each evening for clouds that did not come, and she measured the water in her well by lowering a stone on a string, and she adjusted her watering schedule to stretch every drop as far as it would go. The birds seemed unbothered by the dryness. They scratched in the yard as if nothing had changed, and they continued to lay at the same steady rate, and their feathers took on a deeper, richer sheen in the dry heat, as if they were thriving in conditions that made everything else struggle. Mrs. Hargrove came by in the third week of May, with a face that told Elinor something was wrong before she had even opened her mouth. She sat down at the table without waiting for an invitation, and said that the 2 chicks she had hatched from Elinor's eggs were doing well, but that her other hens, the ordinary ones she had kept for years, had stopped laying entirely. She said it was happening to everyone. The drought was hitting the poultry hard, and the eggs that had always been plentiful in spring were suddenly scarce. The price of eggs at the trading post had doubled in a week, and there were families who were starting to worry about having enough to feed their children through the summer. She looked at Elinor with an expression that mixed hope and desperation in equal measure, and she said, "Your birds are still laying, aren't they?" It was not a question. Elinor nodded. She had 37 eggs in the basket by the stove, gathered over the past 5 days, and she had been wondering what to do with them. She had been planning to sell them in town, maybe use the money to make an extra payment on the note before the bank decided to act. But looking at Mrs. Hargrove's face, she understood that things had changed. She said, "How many families are hurting?" Mrs. Hargrove listed them off on her fingers. The Suttons, who had 7 children and a henhouse full of birds that had gone barren. The Millers, whose spring hatch had died in the shell. The Coles, who had lost 3 laying hens to some kind of wasting sickness that had come through the valley like a bad wind. The list went on. By the time she finished, Elinor was looking at a problem that went far beyond her own small claim. The drought was not just an inconvenience. It was becoming a crisis, and the crisis was landing hardest on the people who had least to spare. Elinor made a decision. She took the basket of eggs from beside the stove, all 37 of them, and she handed it to Mrs. Hargrove. She said, "Take these. Distribute them to the families who need them most. Tell them to set them under whatever broody hens they have left, or to hatch them the way I did, by the stove if they have to. Tell them these eggs will hatch. Tell them these birds can survive whatever this dry spell throws at them." She paused, and then she added, "I will keep as many as I can spare, and I will send word when I have more. But I cannot do this alone. I need help getting the eggs out to the people who need them." Mrs. Hargrove looked at the basket as if it contained something sacred. She said, her voice rough, "You are giving away your living." Elinor shook her head. "I am investing it. If these birds can help people get through this summer, then this valley will have a reason to remember them, and me. That has nothing to do with Walter Prentice, or the territorial office, or any of it. I need more than a piece of paper saying I can keep them. I need people to know what they can do." Mrs. Hargrove took the basket. She was crying, silently, the tears tracking down her round cheeks and dropping onto the golden shells of the eggs. She did not apologize for crying. She simply wiped her face with the back of her hand and said, "I will make sure they go where they are needed." And then she was gone, carrying the basket out into the dry, hot afternoon, and Elinor stood in the doorway and watched her until she disappeared over the ridge. The drought worsened through the first week of June. The creek dried to a series of muddy pools, and the well at Elinor's claim began to pull sand. She reduced her own water use to the absolute minimum, bathing in a tin basin with less than a quart of water, reusing the wash water for the garden, giving the birds only what they absolutely needed. They did not seem to suffer. They drank less than ordinary chickens, she noticed, and they continued to lay at a rate that seemed almost impossible given the conditions. She was collecting a dozen eggs a day from 14 birds, and every single one of them was going out to the families Mrs. Hargrove had identified. She kept nothing for herself except what she needed to hatch the next generation. The eggs that were not distributed were set under the few broody hens that remained in the valley, or in makeshift incubators that women rigged up beside their own stoves, copying the method Elinor had used. The golden birds were spreading, one egg at a time, and with each hatch, another family found itself with a source of food that the drought could not touch. The wasting sickness that Mrs. Hargrove had mentioned began to spread in earnest. It started with the ordinary chickens, the Rhode Island Reds and Plymouth Rocks and Leghorns that had been the backbone of the valley's poultry for years. They would stop eating, stop laying, and then simply die within a matter of days. There was no cure, no treatment, no way to stop it once it entered a flock. By the middle of June, nearly half the chickens in Willow Branch Valley were dead, and the other half were sickening. Only the golden birds, Elinor's birds, and their offspring remained untouched. They moved through the yards of the homesteads where they had been placed, golden and healthy and utterly indifferent to the disease that was decimating every other bird in the territory. Word of this spread faster than the drought had. It spread faster than the sickness had. People began to come to Elinor's claim not just for eggs, but for answers. They wanted to know what made these birds different. They wanted to know if there was a secret to their resistance. They wanted to know if she could sell them more birds, more eggs, anything that might give them a chance of getting through the summer with something left to show for it. Elinor answered their questions as honestly as she could. She told them she did not know why the birds were immune. She told them she had done nothing special, only kept them warm and fed them well and treated them with care. She told them she would give them whatever she could spare, and she asked only that they pass the gift on when their own flocks grew large enough to share. The mood in the valley shifted. The laughter that had followed her through the fall and winter was gone, replaced by something quieter and more respectful. People who had looked away when she passed them on the road now stopped to speak. Women she had never met came to her door with gifts of bread and preserves, offerings of gratitude that she accepted with a grace she had not known she possessed. The transformation was not complete. There were still those who muttered about her good fortune, who hinted that she must have known something she was not telling, who resented the way she had risen from the bottom of the valley's regard to a position she had not asked for. But it was real, and it was happening, and Elinor felt it settling around her like a garment she was still learning to wear. On the 23rd of June, a day so hot that the air shimmered above the dry grass and the horizon wavered like something seen through water, a wagon pulled up to her fence line. It was not Mrs. Hargrove's wagon, and it was not one of the families she had helped. It was a fine wagon, painted black, with a team of matched bays that had not missed a meal in their lives. And sitting in the driver's seat, his face set in an expression that Elinor could not read, was Walter Prentice. He climbed down slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, and he walked to the enclosure where the birds were gathered in the shade of the lean-to. He stood there for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders slumped in a way she had not seen before. And when he finally turned to face her, his voice was different. The authority was still there, but it was worn thin, like a coat that had been patched too many times. He said, "I lost my entire flock, every bird I had, 237 chickens, all dead in the last 10 days. Elinor said nothing. She stood on the step and waited. Prentice looked at the ground, then back at the birds, then at her. He said, "I came to ask if you would sell me some of yours, or eggs, whatever you can spare. I have grandchildren who depend on those eggs. I have a daughter-in-law who has not been able to keep food down since the sickness started, and the only thing she can tolerate is egg custard. I have tried everything else. I have written to the capital. I have sent riders to the next county. Nobody has anything left to sell. You are the only one." His voice cracked on the last word, and he stopped, and he stood there in the hot, shimmering air with his hands at his sides, waiting. Elinor looked at him for a long moment. She remembered the way he had laughed when she refused to sell. She remembered the letters he had sent to the capital. She remembered the bank and the note and the pressure that had been building all spring. But she also remembered what Mrs. Hargrove had said about the families who needed help. And she remembered her own mother's voice from years ago telling her that there was no point in being right if it cost you your humanity. She walked down the steps and across the yard to the enclosure, and she opened the gate and selected 6 of her best layers. birds she had raised from chicks, birds whose eggs she knew would hatch true. She placed them in a crate she had prepared earlier, not knowing until this moment that she would be using it for this purpose. She carried the crate to Prentice's wagon and set it in the bed. And she looked at him, and she said, "These are not for sale. They are a gift. If your flock recovers, you can pass them on to someone else who needs them. That is the only payment I ask." Prentice stared at her. His face worked through a series of expressions that she could not follow. And then he did something that surprised her more than anything else that had happened that day. He took off his hat and held it against his chest, and he said, in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, "Thank you, Mrs. Clay. I will not forget this." He climbed into the wagon and drove away, the golden birds shifting and settling in the crate behind him. And Elinor stood in the yard until the dust from his wheels had settled, and the heat haze had swallowed the last trace of him. Then she went inside and sat down at the table, and she let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Walter Prentice had come to her. Walter Prentice had asked for help. Walter Prentice had said thank you. She did not know what it meant for the future, whether it would last or whether it would fade with the drought. But for this moment, in this small cabin on the edge of the valley, she had won something that no banker and no territorial office and no laughing crowd could ever take away from her. She had won the right to be seen for what she truly was, not a fool with a handful of strange eggs, but a woman who had seen something worth saving and had refused to let the world talk her out of it. July came in like a furnace door swinging open. The grass that had browned in May turned to powder, and the wind that had carried the taste of dust now carried the dust itself, fine and gray, and smelling of something older than the valley. The creek was bone dry by the first week of the month, and the wells that had served the homesteads for 20 years began to fail, one by one. Families who had held on through the sickness and the drought were now facing a new enemy, the emptiness of a land that had nothing left to give. Elinor's well was still producing, though it took longer each morning to fill the bucket, and she guarded every drop with a discipline born of hard experience. The birds did not seem to notice the strain. They moved through the yard with the same deliberate grace they had always shown, their golden feathers catching the harsh summer light and softening it into something almost bearable. They drank sparingly, ate what she gave them, and continued to lay as if the world outside their enclosure did not exist. The eggs were going out faster than she could produce them. Mrs. Hargrove had organized a distribution network that reached every corner of the valley, using the wives of farmers and the daughters of storekeepers to carry baskets of eggs to families who had not yet received any of the golden birds. The network had grown beyond anything Elinor had imagined. Women she had never met were hatching chicks from her stock, raising them, and passing on the gift to others. The golden birds were no longer just hers. They belonged to the valley now, and the valley was beginning to understand what it had received. It was on the 10th of July that the first locusts appeared. They came not as a swarm, but as scouts, a handful of large, dark insects that moved across the dry ground with a purpose that seemed almost sinister. Elinor saw one on the fence post near the enclosure, and watched it for a long moment, noting the way it sat, the way it turned its head, the way it seemed to be testing the air. She had seen locusts before, back in Missouri, but never in numbers that mattered. She knew what they meant when they came in numbers. Everyone did. She killed the scout with the flat of her hand and did not think about it again until 3 days later, when Mrs. Hargrove arrived at her door with news that the farmers on the eastern edge of the valley had reported a cloud on the horizon, moving against the wind, and that it was not a cloud. The swarm arrived on the 14th of July, a Thursday, at midday. The sound preceded it by nearly an hour, a low, rhythmic hum that seemed to come from the earth itself, building in intensity until it vibrated through the bones of the cabin and set the windows rattling in their frames. Elinor stepped outside and looked to the east, and she saw it, a dark band that stretched from one end of the valley to the other, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so vast. The sound grew louder, and the air grew thick with the smell of chitin and dust and something else, something that smelled like the end of things. She called the birds into the shelter she had built for them, a small structure attached to the lean-to with a roof of sod and walls of scrap wood, and she closed the door and latched it. Then she stood in the yard with her shawl pulled up over her mouth and nose, and she watched the swarm come in. It was unlike anything she had ever seen. The locusts filled the sky in a dense, shifting carpet that blotted out the sun and turned the day to twilight. They covered the ground in a layer that rose to her ankles, crawling over each other, over the fence, over the walls of the cabin, over her boots. She could feel them in her hair, on her arms, on the back of her neck, and she could hear nothing but the sound of their bodies moving and feeding and reproducing. They did not attack her. They did not need to. They were not interested in her. They were interested in everything green, everything growing, everything that held moisture and life. She watched them strip the leaves from the young apple tree she had planted the previous spring, watched them reduce it to a skeleton in less than a minute. She watched them cover the garden, the patch of beans and squash that had been her last hope for a summer harvest, and she watched it disappear under a writhing mass of brown and black. The swarm stayed for 2 hours. When it lifted, moving west with the same terrible purpose, it left behind a valley that looked as if a fire had passed through it. Every green thing was gone, every leaf, every stem, every blade of grass that had survived the drought had been consumed. The ground was bare and brown and covered in a layer of locust droppings that smelled sour and dead. The air was still and hot and silent except for the creak of the fence posts settling. Elinor stood in the middle of her yard and looked at what remained. The cabin was still standing. The roof had held. The shelter where she had put the birds was intact. She walked to it on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, and she opened the door. The birds were inside, huddled together in the center of the floor, their feathers slightly ruffled, but their eyes bright and their postures alert. Penny came forward and pressed her head against Elinor's hand, and Elinor felt something break open inside her chest. She sank down onto the dirt floor of the shelter and gathered the birds around her, and she sat there in the dim light, listening to their low, musical sounds, and she let herself feel the loss and the relief together, mixed into something she could not separate. The valley was devastated. Every farm that had not been touched by the golden birds had lost its crops, its pasture, its hope for the winter. The families who had received the birds had lost everything else, but they still had the birds. And the birds, it turned out, had a quality that no one had anticipated. They ate the locusts. Not all of them, not as a primary food source, but when Elinor released them into the yard the next morning, they moved across the bare ground with a purpose she had not seen before, picking at the dead and dying locusts that lay in drifts against the fence and the walls of the cabin. They ate them. They did not get sick. They did not stop laying. They grew stronger on the protein, and their eggs grew richer, and the valley began to understand that the golden birds were not just immune to the disease and tolerant of the drought. They were survivors of a kind that the ordinary world had no name for. The news spread faster than the swarm had. Riders carried it to the next county, and then to the capital. Letters arrived at Elinor's claim from people she had never heard of, asking for birds, asking for eggs, asking for advice. The territorial office sent a second representative, a different man this time, who spent 3 days on her property examining the birds, taking measurements, drawing diagrams, and asking questions that she answered with the same patient thoroughness she had always shown. He left with a crate of eggs and a promise to return with a formal proposal for a breeding program that would distribute the birds across the entire territory. Elinor listened to his proposal without committing to anything. She had learned that promises from men in offices could change with the wind, but she did not say no. Through all of this, Walter Prentice was silent. She saw his wagon twice on the road, moving in the distance, but he did not stop. She heard from Mrs. Hargrove that the 6 birds she had given him were thriving, that they had already produced 3 clutches of eggs, and that Prentice had been seen in town speaking about the golden birds in a tone that was careful and measured, as if he were still deciding what to think about them. She did not press. She did not seek him out. She had given the gift freely, and she had meant what she said about expecting nothing in return. But she knew, somewhere in the back of her mind, that the silence would not last. A man like Walter Prentice did not accept a gift without eventually finding a way to acknowledge it. The question was whether the acknowledgement would come in the form of gratitude or something else. August arrived with the same dry heat, and the valley continued to recover slowly from the locusts. The golden birds had become the primary source of eggs for nearly every family within 20 miles, and the network that Mrs. Hargrove had built was now distributing chicks as fast as they could be hatched. Elinor's own flock had grown to 42 birds, and she had begun to keep them in 2 separate enclosures to prevent overcrowding. She was collecting nearly 3 dozen eggs a day, and she was selling them at a price that was fair but not extravagant, because she had learned that scarcity had a way of corrupting people, and she did not want to be corrupted. The letter from the bank arrived on the 17th of August, delivered by a boy on a mule who did not meet her eyes when he handed it over. She opened it standing in the yard, with the birds gathered around her feet, and she read it twice before she understood what it was saying. Her note was being called in. The full balance of $47.16 was due within 30 days, or the bank would take possession of the property. The letter was signed by Silas Treadwell, president of the Grover's Crossing Bank, and it was dated 2 days prior. She looked at the date and calculated how many days she had. 28. She had 28 days to find $47, or she would lose the land, the cabin, and the birds with it. She sat down on the step, the letter in her hand, and she looked out at the bare brown yard and the enclosure full of golden birds and the distant line of the hills that marked the edge of her claim. She had known this was coming. She had known it since the day Mrs. Hargrove brought the first warning. But knowing it and seeing it in writing were 2 different things, and the written words carried a weight that knowing could not prepare her for. She did not have $47. She had $11 and a few cents saved in the crack in the wall behind the stove, and she had the eggs she had gathered that morning, and she had the birds. The birds were worth more than $47, but selling them would mean breaking up the flock, and breaking up the flock would mean losing the foundation of everything she had built. She sat on the step for a long time thinking, and then she folded the letter and put it in her pocket and went inside to start the fire. She had 28 days. She would find a way. The next morning a wagon pulled up to her fence line. It was not Mrs. Hargrove's wagon, and it was not Walter Prentice's wagon. It was a wagon she did not recognize, driven by a woman she had never seen, with 2 children in the back and a crate of eggs on the seat beside her. The woman climbed down and introduced herself as Sarah Cole from the north end of the valley, and she said she had come to bring eggs. She said her golden birds had been laying so well that she had more than she could use, and she had heard that Elinor was in trouble with the bank, and she wanted to help. She set the crate on the ground, 4 dozen eggs, large and golden and warm, and she said she would be back next week with more. She said there were others who wanted to help too, and she had been sent to speak for them. Elinor stood in the yard with the crate of eggs at her feet and felt tears pressing at the back of her throat. She did not let them fall. She thanked Sarah Cole, and she watched the wagon drive away, and then she carried the crate inside and added its contents to the store she was building. By the end of the week, she had received eggs and money and offers of help from a dozen different families, all of them bearing the mark of the golden birds. The banknote was still due, and the amount was still daunting, but for the first time since the letter had arrived, Elinor felt the possibility that she might not have to face it alone. On the 23rd day of the 30, a rider came from town with a sealed envelope. It was not from the bank. It was from Walter Prentice. Elinor opened it with steady hands and read it standing in the yard, and the letter said that a group of families in the valley had taken up a collection to cover her debt, and that the full amount had been paid to Silas Treadwell that morning. The letter did not say who had organized the collection, but it was signed with Walter Prentice's name, and beneath it, in a different hand, were the words, "With gratitude." Elinor read the letter a second time, and then she folded it carefully and placed it in the wooden box with the other letters. She walked out to the enclosure and stood among the birds, and she let the tears come at last, not from sorrow, but from something she had not felt in so long that she had almost forgotten its name. The morning after the letter arrived, Elinor woke to a sky that had changed. The endless dry blue was gone, replaced by a soft, hazy gray that stretched from horizon to horizon without break, and the air carried a weight it had not held in months. She stood on the step and felt it against her skin, the promise of moisture, the first hint that the drought might be breaking. She did not allow herself to hope too much. She had learned that hope was a thing to be handled carefully, like a fragile egg that could crack if you held it too tight. But she let herself breathe a little deeper, and she let her shoulders drop a little lower, and she stood there until the birds began to stir in their enclosure, and the first light of the true dawn pushed through the gray. She went through her chores with the same steady hands she had always used, feeding the birds, cleaning the water troughs, gathering the eggs. The count was 32 that morning, a good number, and she set them in the basket by the stove to be distributed later. The routine was familiar, almost comfortable, but there was a new quality to it now, a lightness that had not been there before. The debt was gone. The land was hers. The threat that had hung over her for months had been lifted by the hands of the very people she had helped, and she did not know how to repay them, except by continuing to do what she had always done. Mrs. Hargrove arrived before noon, her face flushed with a mixture of excitement and something else, something that looked like pride. She climbed down from her wagon with a basket in her hands and a letter in her pocket, and she sat down at the table across from Elinor without waiting to be asked. She said that Walter Prentice had called a meeting at the schoolhouse for the following Sunday. She said that he had asked for the entire valley to be invited, and that he had specifically requested that Elinor be present. She said she did not know what he intended to say, but that she had heard from Thomas Briggs, the young man who worked for Prentice, that the old man had been acting strangely ever since the debt was paid. Quieter, more thoughtful, as if he had been turned inside out by something he could not explain. Elinor listened to all of this without changing her expression, and then she nodded and said she would be there. The schoolhouse was full by the time she arrived on Sunday afternoon. Families she had never met, families she had helped, families who had mocked her, and families who had defended her, all of them packed into the narrow benches that had been set up for the occasion. The air was heavy with the smell of dust and sweat, and the particular tension that comes when a community gathers to witness something that might change the way they see themselves. Elinor stood at the back, not wanting to push to the front, but Mrs. Hargrove took her by the elbow and guided her to a seat near the front, where the light from the windows fell across the wooden floor in long golden rectangles. Walter Prentice stood at the front of the room, beside the teacher's desk, his hat in his hands. He looked older than he had in the spring, the lines on his face deeper, his shoulders more rounded. He waited until the room had fallen silent, and then he cleared his throat and began to speak. He said that he had called the meeting to say something that he should have said months ago, something that had been sitting in his chest, like a stone that he could not swallow and could not cough up. He said that when the golden birds had first appeared in the valley, he had dismissed them as a curiosity, a mistake, a fool's errand pursued by a woman who did not know any better. He said that he had used his influence to try to stop them, to pressure the territorial office, to call in the banknote, to do everything in his power to prove that he had been right and she had been wrong. He said that he had been wrong. He said that Elinor Clay had seen something that no one else in the valley had been able to see, and that she had held on to it through mockery and drought and sickness and locusts, and that she had given it away freely to anyone who needed it. He said that if it had not been for her, he would have lost everything, not just his flock, but his grandchildren's health, his daughter-in-law's peace of mind, his own sense of what it meant to be part of a community. He said that he had been a proud, stubborn, foolish man, and that he was sorry. He stopped speaking, and the room was silent. Then he turned to Elinor, who was sitting in the front row with her hands folded in her lap, and he said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Elinor Clay, I was wrong about you. I was wrong about your birds, and I am grateful, more grateful than I know how to say, that you did not let my blindness stop you from doing what you knew was right." The silence held for a long moment, and then someone began to clap. It was Mrs. Hargrove, her hands meeting in firm, steady applause that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. Then Sarah Cole joined in, then Thomas Briggs, then the families who had received the golden birds and watched them thrive. The applause grew until it filled the schoolhouse, and Elinor sat in the front row with her hands still folded in her lap, and she felt the tears tracking down her cheeks, and she did not wipe them away. When the applause had died down, Elinor stood. She walked to the front of the room and faced the crowd, and she said that she had not done it alone. She said that the birds had done their part, and the women of the valley had done theirs, and that the only thing she had done was refuse to give up on something she believed in. She said that she had been as scared as anyone, as uncertain as anyone, but that she had learned that fear and uncertainty were not reasons to stop. She said that if the golden birds had taught her anything, it was that the things that looked strangest, that seemed most unlikely, were often the very things that the world needed most. Then she sat down, and the room was quiet again. And then Walter Prentice stepped forward and extended his hand to her. She took it, and they shook, and the room erupted in applause a second time. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Elinor had ever experienced. The rains came, finally, in the first week of September, falling in long, steady sheets that soaked the parched ground and brought a green that the valley had not seen since spring. The creek began to run again, and the wells rose, and the gardens that had been stripped by the locusts were replanted with seeds that had been saved from the attack. The golden birds continued to multiply, and the territorial office, true to its promise, established a formal breeding program that distributed birds across the entire territory. Elinor was given a stipend for her contribution, and a title that she did not ask for, but accepted with quiet dignity. Founder of the Clay strain, the first documented breed of poultry to originate in the Wyoming Territory. She stayed on her claim. She did not move to a larger house or buy fancy furniture or change the way she lived. She added a second room to the cabin, and she built a proper coop for the birds, and she planted a new apple tree where the old one had been stripped. But she remained the same woman who had walked home from Grover's Crossing with a flour sack full of eggs that nobody wanted, and she remained in the same place where she had knelt on the plank floor and watched the first golden chick push its way into the world. On a cool October morning, a year to the day from the moment she had first seen the eggs at the market, Elinor stood in the yard with the birds gathered around her feet. Penny, now a great golden hen with feathers that caught the low autumn light like hammered metal, pressed her head against Elinor's hand and made the low musical sound that had become the signature of the breed. Elinor reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a single feather she had found that morning, a long, curved feather from Penny's wing, warm to the touch and the color of honey held up to the sun. She turned it over in her fingers, feeling the smoothness of the vein and the firmness of the shaft, and she thought about how far she had come from the morning she had stood in the market with 37 cents in her palm. She tucked the feather into the wooden box where she kept the letters and the record of that first night, and she closed the lid and set it back on the shelf. Then she walked out to the enclosure and opened the gate, and the birds followed her into the yard, moving in a golden stream that caught the light and held it. She stood among them, one woman on a small claim at the edge of the territory, and she knew that the story she had started with a single absurd decision would outlive her, carried forward by the birds and the eggs and the people who had learned to see the world a little differently because of what she had done. This is Elias Vance, and you have been listening to Frontier Secrets. Subscribe and step back in time. The frontier hides more than it shows.